The long voyage of the Polynesian breadfruit canoes. Hey guys. Tonight we're going to drift far, far away from the usual parade of inbred monarchs and sad medieval children. Instead, we're going to float out into the Pacific, a place where the kings didn't have gout from too much venison, but instead had the slightly more practical problem of trying not to starve on a canoe in the middle of the world's largest ocean. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's talk about breadfruit. Yes, breadfruit. A food that looks like a green, spiky melon, tastes vaguely like a potato that's been left in the sun too long, and somehow became the cornerstone of one of the most ambitious human migrations in history. Because, when you think about it, nothing says bedtime story quite like thousands of miles of open water, a canoe made of lashed wood, and a fruit that nobody outside the tropics really knows what to do with. Now, the Polynesians, those legendary navigators, didn't just wake up one day and say, "You know what? Let's paddle to Hawaii." No, this was a slow, deliberate, and frankly absurdly impressive process of moving people, pigs, chickens, and yes, breadfruit trees, across distances that make Columbus look like he was just out for a Sunday rowboat ride. And the breadfruit canoe story is one of those tales that's both deeply practical and deeply weird. Practical because breadfruit was a staple crop that could feed entire communities. Weird because transporting a tree across the ocean is not exactly the easiest thing to do. You can't just toss a sapling in your backpack and hope for the best. You have to carefully wrap the roots, keep them moist, and then pray that your canoe doesn't capsize halfway between Tahiti and some random atoll. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start with the basics. The fruit that pretends to be bread, or Artocarpus altulus, if you want to sound like you're showing off at a botany conference, is one of those plants that seems almost designed to confuse outsiders. It's not bread. It's not fruit in the way we think of fruit. It's more like a starchy, bready vegetable disguised as a tropical orb. When roasted, it has this fluffy, bread-like texture, which is where the name comes from. For Polynesians, breadfruit was a godsend. It grew on trees, which meant you didn't have to bend over in the fields like with taro. It produced massive yields, enough to feed entire families. And it could be preserved in pits underground, fermented into a kind of sour paste that could last for years. Imagine a giant, tropical sourdough starter. Except, instead of making hipster loaves, it was your emergency ration for when the fishing was bad. So, naturally, when Polynesians set out on their epic voyages, breadfruit came along. Not as a snack, but as a living, breathing passenger. Canoes weren't just boats. They were floating ecosystems. You had people, animals, tools, and carefully wrapped breadfruit saplings, all crammed together on a double-hulled canoe that was basically the ancient Pacific version of a U-haul. Canoes. The original long-haul flight sleds pause for a moment to appreciate the canoe. Because when we say canoe, most people picture a flimsy little thing you rent at a lake, where you spend more time trying not to tip over than actually moving forward. Polynesian canoes were not that. These were engineering marvels. Double-hulled, lashed together with coconut fiber ropes, capable of carrying dozens of people and tons of cargo. They were sleek, fast, and, most importantly, seaworthy enough to cross thousands of miles of open ocean. And the navigators who steered them didn't have compasses, maps, or GPS. They had the stars, the swells, the flight of birds, and an encyclopedic knowledge of how the ocean behaves. Imagine being able to look at the way a wave hits your canoe and say, Ah yes, we're about 200 miles east of Tahiti. That's the level of skill we're talking about. Meanwhile, most European sailors of the same era were still hugging coastlines and praying they didn't fall off the edge of the world. And into these canoes went the breadfruit. Because if you're going to colonize a new island, you need food. And breadfruit was the perfect candidate. The problem of moving a tree, here's the thing about breadfruit. It doesn't grow from seeds, or at least, not the kind Polynesians wanted. The best breadfruit varieties are seedless, which is great if you're eating them, but terrible if you're trying to propagate them. You can't just toss a handful of seeds into the dirt and wait. You have to take cuttings or suckers from the roots and grow new trees from those sow. When Polynesians set out on their voyages, they had to bring living breadfruit plants with them. Wrapped in coconut husks, kept damp, and treated like precious cargo. Imagine being on a canoe in the middle of the Pacific, surrounded by salt water, and your job is to keep a tropical tree alive. It's like trying to keep a houseplant alive on a road trip. Except the road trip is 2,000 miles long and your car is made of wood and rope. And yet, they did it. Over and over again. Which is why breadfruit ended up being spread across the Pacific, from Samoa to Hawaii to the Marquesas. Let's drift back in time now. To really appreciate this, we need to float back a few thousand years. The story of the breadfruit canoes is part of the larger story of the Polynesian expansion. Starting somewhere around 1500 BCE, people from Southeast Asia began moving eastward into the Pacific. They brought with them their crops, their animals, and their seafaring skills. By around 1000 BCE, they had reached places like Samoa and Tonga. From there, over the next millennium, they pushed further and further east, eventually reaching the Marquesas, Hawaii, Easter Island, and even New Zealand. And at every step, breadfruit was part of the package. Alongside taro, yam, coconut, and banana, it was one of the canoe plants, the essential crops that Polynesians carried with them to make life possible on new islands. Breadfruit as status symbol, of course. Breadfruit wasn't just food. It was also a status symbol. In some islands, breadfruit groves were tied to noble lineages. Chiefs controlled the best groves, and commoners had to rely on whatever scraps they could get. Because nothing says elite power like controlling access to a fruit that tastes like a bland potato pancake in Hawaii. Breadfruit was considered a sacred gift from the gods. In Tahiti, it was central to myths and rituals. And in some places, breadfruit trees were planted as part of marriage arrangements, like a dowry. Forget giving someone a gold ring. Give them a tree that will feed their family for generations. A gentle transition, let's float for a moment. Imagine the scene. A double-hulled canoe, sails made of woven mats, gliding silently across the Pacific under a canopy of stars. In the hull, wrapped carefully in coconut husks, are the roots of breadfruit trees. The crew tends to them, making sure they don't dry out. Because those trees are the future. Without them, the new island will be just another rock in the ocean. With them, it becomes a home. And so, the breadfruit canoes weren't just about food. They were about survival, identity, and the incredible human drive to keep moving forward. Even when the horizon never seems to end. Navigation, reading the ocean like a book. So, let's talk about the navigators, because honestly, they're the real stars of this story. Breadfruit may have been the passenger, but the navigators were the pilots. And unlike modern pilots, they didn't have radar or autopilot, or even a snack cart with tiny bags of pretzels. Instead, they had the stars. The night sky was their map, and they memorized it with an intensity that would make your high school astronomy teacher weep. Each star had a rising and setting point on the horizon, and navigators knew exactly which ones lined up with which islands. But it wasn't just stars. They read the swells of the ocean, the way waves bounced off distant islands, the flight paths of seabirds, even the color of the water. They could tell when they were near land just by noticing a faint greenish tint in the sea. Imagine being able to look at the ocean and say, "Yep, land's about 100 miles that way." Meanwhile, most of us can't even find our car in a parking lot. And this wasn't just a hobby. It was a sacred skill passed down through generations. Navigators were trained from childhood, memorizing charts that encoded star paths and ocean patterns. It was like learning a song, except the lyrics told you how not to die in the middle of the Pacific canoe plant. The floating garden now, Breadfruit wasn't traveling alone. It was part of a whole entourage of canoe plants. These were the essential crops Polynesians carried with them to new islands. Taro, yam, banana, coconut, sugarcane, and pandanus all made the trip. Each had its role. Taro was the starchy staple. Coconut gave water and oil. Pandanus leaves were woven into mats and sails, but breadfruit was special. It was the high-yield, low-effort crop. A single tree could produce hundreds of fruits a year, and once established, it basically took care of itself. No plowing, no weeding, no back-breaking labor. Just a tree that quietly churned out food for decades. So, when a canoe landed on a new island, one of the first priorities was planting breadfruit. It was like setting up the pantry. You could build houses later. You could figure out politics later. But first, make sure the breadfruit trees are in the ground. Breadfruit myths and legends, of course. No staple crop is complete without a few myths attached. In Hawaii, there's the story of Ku, the god of war, who once lived as a man. During a famine, he buried himself in the ground, and from his body grew the first breadfruit tree, feeding his family and saving the people, which is both touching and slightly unsettling. In Tahiti, breadfruit was linked to fertility and abundance. Planting a breadfruit tree was sometimes part of marriage rituals, symbolizing the start of a new household. Because nothing says romance like, "Here, darling, I got you a tree that will drop heavy fruit on your head for the next 50 years. And in some islands, breadfruit was tied to rank. Chiefs had the best groves, and commoners had to make do with whatever was left, which is a very human thing to do. Turn food into a status symbol. The logistics of canoe lifelets. Take a moment to imagine daily life on one of these voyages. You're on a double-hulled canoe, maybe 60 feet long. There are a few dozen people on board, plus pigs, chickens, dogs, and bundles of plants. Space is tight. Privacy is non-existent. And you're weeks away from land. Food is rationed. Fresh water is precious. You fish when you can, but you also have to keep an eye on the breadfruit saplings, making sure they don't dry out or get splashed with salt water. Because if they die, the whole point of the voyage is ruined at night. You sleep under the stars, lulled by the endless rocking of the ocean. During the day, you bail water, adjust sails, and try not to think about how much you miss solid ground. And through it all, the navigator keeps watch, reading the sky and the sea, guiding the canoe towards some speck of land that nobody else can see yet. It's both terrifying and oddly peaceful, the kind of thing that makes you wonder how many voyages failed, how many canoes vanished into the blue, But the ones that succeeded changed the map of the Pacific forever. Breadfruit storage. The underground pantry, one of the cleverest things Polynesians did with breadfruit was figure out how to store it long term. Fresh breadfruit doesn't last very long. It ripens quickly, and then it's basically compost. But if you peel it, mash it, and bury it in a pit lined with leaves, it ferments into a paste called mahi or masi. This paste could last for years. It didn't taste great. Imagine a sour, cheesy dough, but it kept people alive during famines or when storms destroyed crops. It was the ultimate insurance policy, so when breadfruit trees were planted on new islands, people weren't just thinking about the next meal. They were thinking about the next decade, about making sure their grandchildren wouldn't starve. A gentle drift toward expansion by around 1000 CE. Polynesians had spread breadfruit across much of the Pacific. From Samoa and Tonga to Tahiti, the Marquesas, and Hawaii, the trees took root. Each island developed its own traditions around breadfruit, its own recipes, its own rituals, and the voyages continued. Canoes kept pushing outward, carrying people and plants to the farthest corners of the ocean, to Easter Island, where breadfruit struggled in the poor soil, to New Zealand, where the climate was too cold and breadfruit couldn't survive. But still, the attempt was made. Because breadfruit wasn't just food. It was part of what it meant to be Polynesian. The irony of breadfruit's later fame here's the ironic twist. For centuries, breadfruit was the lifeblood of Polynesian societies. But when Europeans showed up, they mostly ignored it. Until, of course, they realized it could be useful for feeding enslaved laborers in the Caribbean. Cue the infamous voyage of the HMS Bounty, where Captain Bligh tried to transport breadfruit from Tahiti to the West Indies. That story, with its mutiny and drama, tends to overshadow the much older, much more impressive story of Polynesians moving breadfruit across the Pacific. Because apparently, history books love a good mutiny more than they love a quiet, steady achievement. But tonight, we're not here for mutinies. We're here for the slow, steady rhythm of canoes gliding across the ocean, carrying trees that would feed generations. Let's pause here, as we close out this first stretch of our long, sleepy voyage. Picture it again. The stars overhead, the endless ocean below, and in the hull of the canoe, a bundle of roots wrapped in coconut husks, fragile, precious, and destined to become a grove of breadfruit trees on some distant shore. Groves of power, rituals of breadfruit settling, and so you've landed on your new island. The canoe is pulled up on the beach, the pigs are squealing, the chickens are running around like they own the place, and the breadfruit saplings are still miraculously alive. Congratulations, you've just joined the long line of Polynesian settlers who managed to pull off one of the most difficult moving days in human history. Now comes the real work, planting, because without breadfruit, this island is just a pretty rock. With breadfruit, it becomes a home. And not just any home, but one with a built-in social hierarchy. Because of course, food always turns into politics. Breadfruit as social currency in many Polynesian societies. Breadfruit groves weren't just orchards. They were symbols of power. Chiefs controlled the best groves, and access to breadfruit could be restricted or taxed. If you wanted to eat, you needed permission, which is a very human thing to do. Take something that grows freely on trees and turn it into a tool of authority. In Tahiti, for example, breadfruit was tied to the Arai, the chiefly class. They had the largest groves, and their ability to feed people during feasts reinforced their status. Because nothing says I'm in charge like handing out free carbs. In Hawaii, breadfruit was considered sacred. Certain groves were curfew off limits, except for rituals or offerings. Chiefs could demand breadfruit as tribute, and commoners who broke the rules could face punishment. Imagine getting in trouble for picking the wrong fruit at the wrong time. Rituals of planting. A breadfruit tree wasn't just a matter of digging a hole and sticking it in the ground. It was often accompanied by rituals, chants, prayers, offerings to the gods. Because this wasn't just agriculture, it was cosmology. You weren't just planting food, you were planting life, abundance, and continuity. In some places, planting a breadfruit tree was part of marriage ceremonies. A couple might plant one together as a symbol of their new household, which is sweet in a practical sort of way. Forget roses or chocolates. Give your partner a tree that will feed your descendants for generations. And in times of famine, rituals were performed to encourage breadfruit trees to bear fruit. Priests might offer sacrifices or recite chants, trying to coax the trees into producing. Because when you're hungry, you'll try anything, even politely asking a tree to hurry up. Breadfruit and the calendar breadfruit also shaped the calendar. In many islands, the year was divided into breadfruit seasons. The arrival of ripe fruit marked certain festivals or ceremonies. People timed their activities around the cycles of the trees. In Hawaii, the breadfruit season was a time of abundance, when feasts and games were held. In Tahiti, breadfruit harvests were linked to religious observances. The rhythm of life was tied to the rhythm of the trees. It's a reminder that agriculture isn't just about food. It's about time, ritual, and meaning. Breadfruit wasn't just eaten. It was celebrated, feared, and woven into the fabric of society, the architecture of groves. Let's take a walk through a breadfruit grove. The trees are tall, with broad-lobed leaves that cast deep shade. The fruits hang heavy, green and spiky, sometimes as big as your head. Beneath the trees, the ground is cool and damp. Groves weren't random. They were carefully planned. Trees were planted in rows, tended, and sometimes intercropped with other plants. In some islands, groves were passed down through families, becoming part of inheritance. Owning a grove meant security. It meant status, and groves weren't just practical. They were beautiful, shady, green, full of life. They were places of gathering, of ritual, of storytelling. Imagine sitting under a breadfruit tree, listening to an elder recite myths about gods and ancestors, while the fruits ripen overhead. Breadfruit and famine, of course. Breadfruit wasn't always reliable. Trees could fail. Storms could destroy groves. Droughts could wither them. And when that happened, famine followed. That's why the underground storage pits were so important. Fermented breadfruit paste was the safety net. It didn't taste great, but it kept people alive. And in times of scarcity, chiefs who controlled the storage pits gained even more power. There are stories of people surviving on nothing but fermented breadfruit for months. Imagine eating sour, cheesy paste every day, knowing that without it, you'd starve. It's not glamorous, but it's survival. Breadfruit in song and story breadfruit wasn't just food. It was culture. It appeared in songs, chants, and proverbs. In some places, breadfruit was a metaphor for abundance, for generosity, for family. In Hawaii, there's a saying, "Hei ulu o kajina," the land is like breadfruit, meaning the land provides. In Tahiti, breadfruit was praised in chants as a gift of the gods. Even today, breadfruit remains a cultural symbol. In some Pacific communities, planting a breadfruit tree is still seen as an act of care for future generations. A way of saying, I was here and I thought of you. A gentle drift toward politics, so let's float back to the politics of it all. Because breadfruit wasn't just about survival, it was about control. Chiefs who could provide breadfruit during feasts gained loyalty. Chiefs who failed lost face. Feasts were political theater. Imagine a chief hosting a massive gathering with piles of roasted breadfruit, pigs, and fish. The message was clear. Look how much food I can provide. Look how powerful I am. And of course, the commoners ate, sang, and danced, while quietly noting who had the biggest breadfruit pile. Because politics is always, at its core, about who controls the snacks. Breadfruit beyond Polynesians. Worth noting that breadfruit wasn't unique to Polynesia. It originated in Southeast Asia and was spread westward to places like the Philippines and Indonesia. But it was in Polynesia that breadfruit became truly central, woven into every aspect of life. And later, when Europeans discovered it, they saw it not as a sacred crop, but as a cheap food source for enslaved laborers. Which is a depressingly predictable twist. The same fruit that symbolized abundance and care in Polynesia became a tool of exploitation in the Caribbean. But that's a story for later. For now, we're still drifting among the groves, listening to the rustle of leaves and the distant crash of waves. The politics of feasting lets picture a feast. Not the kind where you awkwardly balance a paper plate at a family barbecue, but a full-blown Polynesian feast. Canoes of fish hauled in, pigs roasted in underground ovens, taro pounded into poi, and of course, piles of roasted breadfruit. Now, this wasn't just dinner. This was politics. Chiefs used feasts to show off their wealth and power. The bigger the feast, the more loyal the followers. Breadfruit was the centerpiece, the carbohydrate foundation of the whole spectacle. And it wasn't just about feeding people. It was about spectacle. Imagine a chief standing proudly in front of a mountain of breadfruit, basically saying, "Look at me. I can feed you all. Stick with me, and you'll never go hungry." It's the ancient equivalent of a campaign rally, except with fewer speeches and more roasted starch. Breadfruit as tribute. In some islands, breadfruit was collected as tribute. Commoners had to bring part of their harvest to the chief, who then redistributed it during feasts or stored it for emergencies. This system reinforced hierarchy. The chief wasn't just a political leader. He was the provider, the one who controlled the flow of food. And breadfruit, with its abundance and storability, was perfect for this role. It's a reminder that food is never just food. It's power, obligation, and identity. And breadfruit, bland as it might taste, carried enormous weight in the social order. Breadfruit and warriors, even war. Because if you control the breadfruit groves, you control survival. Raids sometimes targeted groves, destroying trees to weaken enemies. It was a slow kind of warfare, less about immediate victory, more about starving your rivals over time. And since breadfruit trees take years to mature, losing a grove wasn't just a temporary setback. It was a generational blow. Imagine watching your enemy chop down the trees your grandparents planted. That's not just war. That's erasing your future. Breadfruit and identity. Breadfruit also became a marker of identity. Different islands had different varieties, different ways of cooking, different rituals. In some places, breadfruit was roasted. In others, it was boiled, baked, or fermented. Each community had its own breadfruit culture, its own sense of pride. Travelers could sometimes tell where someone was from by the way they prepared breadfruit. It was like a culinary accent. And just as accents can spark rivalry or pride, so too could breadfruit traditions. The breadfruit economy. Let's not forget the practical side. Breadfruit was the backbone of the economy. It fed workers, supported families, and allowed societies to grow. Without it, large populations would have been impossible. And because it was so central, it shaped everything else. Labor patterns, land ownership, inheritance, even gender roles. In some places, men planted and tended the trees, while women prepared the food. In others, the roles were reversed. Either way, breadfruit structured daily life. Breadfruit in daily diet. So, what did people actually eat? A lot of breadfruit, obviously. Roasted, baked, boiled, mashed. Sometimes mixed with coconut milk, sometimes eaten plain. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling. And when combined with fish, taro, and other staples, it made for a balanced diet. Polynesians weren't just surviving, they were thriving, building complex societies supported by the humble breadfruit. Breadfruit and the sacred web touched on this, but it's worth emphasizing. Breadfruit wasn't just practical, it was sacred. In myths, it came from the gods. In rituals, it was offered to ancestors. In ceremonies, it marked transitions, birth, marriage, death. Eating breadfruit wasn't just eating. It was participating in a cosmic cycle, connecting with the divine, which is a lot of pressure for a fruit that looks like a spiky green football, a gentle drift toward voyaging a Gandin. Yet, for all its importance on land, breadfruit's greatest story is still tied to the sea. Because without the Voyages, without the canoes, breadfruit would never have spread across the Pacific. So, as we close this extended part 2, let's picture it again. The groves heavy with fruit, the feasts echoing with laughter, the chiefs counting their tribute, the myths whispered under the trees. Breadfruit wasn't just food. It was the glue that held societies together. And it was the passenger that made the voyages possible. Life afloat, canoes, cargo, and the long blue road setting out against it. The breadfruit saplings are packed, the pigs are squealing. The chickens are glaring at you like they know this is going to be a rough trip, and the canoe is ready. Time to push off. The shoreline fades, the horizon swallows you, and suddenly it's just you, your crew, and a whole lot of ocean. This is the part of the story where most of us would panic. No land in sight, new compass, new GPS, just the stars, waves, and the faint hope that the navigator knows what they're doing. But for Polynesians, this was normal. This was Tuesday. The canoe as a floating world. Let's talk about the canoe itself. Because this wasn't just a boat, it was a floating world. A double-hulled canoe could be 60 to 100 feet long, with a platform connecting the hulls. On that platform, you had people, animals, plants, tools, and supplies. It was crowded. It was messy. It was noisy. But it was also astonishingly efficient. Every inch of space was used. Every item had a purpose. You weren't just traveling, you were transplanting an entire ecosystem. Think of it as the ancient Pacific version of a space shuttle, except instead of heading into orbit, you were heading into the unknown, with breadfruit saplings instead of oxygen tanks. The Navigators burden at the heart of it all was the navigator, the one person everyone depended on, the one who could read the stars, the swells, the birds, the clouds. Navigators memorized star maps, literally hundreds of stars, each with its rising and setting point. They knew how to track the sun, how to read the color of the sea, how to notice the faint reflection of islands on the underside of clouds. It was a skill that took decades to master, and it wasn't written down. It was memorized, chanted, sung, passed from teacher to student in long nights of recitation. Imagine cramming for an exam where the subject is "Don't kill everyone by getting lost at sea." No pressure. Daily life on the canoe. What was it like day to day? Sleeping, you slept under the stars, on mats, with the constant rocking of the canoe. Privacy was non-existent. If someone snored, everyone knew. Eating meals were simple. Fish caught along the way, coconuts, preserved taro, and whatever else you had packed. Breadfruit saplings weren't eaten. They were too precious. They were the future pantry, not the present one. Work constant. Adjusting sails, bailing water, repairing ropes, tending animals, checking the plants. A canoe was like a toddler. It always needed attention. Waiting, lots of it. Days of endless horizon, nothing but blue. The kind of monotony that makes you start naming the waves just to stay sane, and through it all, the navigator kept watch, eyes scanning the sky and sea, mind ticking through the memorized map of the Pacific. The fragile cargo, let's not forget the breadfruit, wrapped in coconut husks, kept damp, shaded from the sun. The crew had to check them constantly. Too much salt water, and they'd die. Too much heat, and they'd wither. It was like carrying a baby, except the baby was a tree, and if it died, your grandchildren would starve. No pressure, and it wasn't just breadfruit. Canoes carried taro cuttings, yam tubers, sugarcane stalks, banana shoots, each one carefully packed, each one essential. The canoe wasn't just a boat. It was Noah's Ark, but with better navigation and fewer giraffes. The silence of the sea, one of the strangest things about these voyages, must have been the silence. No engines, no modern noise, just the creak of wood, the slap of waves, the rustle of sails at night. The stars stretched from horizon to horizon, brighter than most of us will ever see. The Milky Way arched overhead, a glowing path across the sky, and the navigator would quietly trace it, steering the canoe by starlight. It was beautiful, yes, but also terrifying, because beauty doesn't feed you. And if the navigator made a mistake, the silence could become permanent. The risk of failure, not every voyage succeeded. Some canoes vanished, some turned back. Some landed on islands too barren to support life, but enough succeeded that Polynesians managed to settle the most remote islands on Earth, Hawaii, Easter Island, New Zealand, all reached by canoe, all supplied with breadfruit and other crops. It's one of the greatest feats of human exploration, and it was done without compasses, without maps, without metal ships. Just wood, rope, plants, and knowledge. Breadfruit as the prize through it all. Breadfruit remained the prize, the reason for the voyage. The promise of abundance on a new island. When the canoe finally landed, when the saplings were planted, when the first fruits ripened, that was the moment of triumph. The voyage had succeeded. The island was no longer just a rock. It was a home, a gentle drift toward Legasian. So, the breadfruit canoes weren't just about survival. They were about legacy. Each voyage carried not just people and plants, but culture, language, and identity. The spread of breadfruit across the Pacific is the story of how Polynesians turned the ocean from a barrier into a highway. How they carried their world with them, tree by tree, island by island. All right. Let's stay on the canoe a little longer and keep part 3 flowing. We'll expand the lived experience of voyaging, the rhythms of life at sea, and the way breadfruit and other canoe plants shaped the journey. Same sleepy, dry, slightly snarky, sleepless historian tone, drifting along without hurry. The rhythm of the voyage life on a canoe wasn't a sprint. It was a rhythm. Days blurred into each other, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun, the changing constellations, and the endless sound of water against wood. Morning meant checking the sails, feeding the animals, and making sure the breadfruit saplings hadn't dried out overnight. Midday meant fishing, repairing ropes, and trying not to roast under the tropical sun. Evening meant quiet, as the stars came out and the navigator began his real work. It was monotonous, yes, but monotony was survival. You didn't want surprises on a canoe. Surprises usually meant storms, leaks, or running out of food. And nobody wanted that. Storms and struggles, of course. Storms did happen. The Pacific isn't exactly a calm pond. Sudden squalls could rip sails, swamp canoes, and scatter supplies. When that happened, the crew had to act fast. Bail water, lash down cargo, pray the breadfruit saplings didn't get washed overboard. Imagine trying to keep a bundle of roots alive while waves are crashing over your head. It's the kind of multitasking nobody asks for, and yet they managed, because they had to. The voyage wasn't optional. It was survival, expansion, destiny. The animals on board. Let's not forget the animals. Pigs, chickens, and dogs all made the trip. They were noisy, smelly, and occasionally uncooperative. But they were essential. Pigs provided meat. Chickens gave eggs. Dogs were companions, hunters, and sometimes food as well. And all of them had to be fed and watered, just like the humans. It turned the canoe into a floating farmyard. Imagine trying to sleep while a pig snuffles next to you and a chicken decides. 3 a.m. is the perfect time to announce the dawn. Romantic, it was not. The navigator's night was when the navigator truly shone. While everyone else tried to sleep, he lay awake, watching the stars. Each constellation was a signpost. Each star path a road across the sea. He didn't just look up. He listened to the waves, felt the swells against the hull, noted the flight of seabirds at dawn. It was a full-body awareness, a constant reading of the world, and he carried it all in memory. No maps, no charts, just chants and mental images. The ocean was his textbook, the stars his syllabus, and failure wasn't an option. The breadfruit's quiet journey, meanwhile, the breadfruit saplings sat quietly in their bundles. They didn't complain. They didn't snore. They just needed water, shade, and care. But their survival was everything. Without them, the voyage was pointless. You could land on the most beautiful island in the world, but without breadfruit, it wouldn't sustain a community. So the crew tended them like treasures, checking the roots, keeping them damp, shielding them from salt spray. It was a quiet, constant act of devotion. The psychological drift weeks at sea did strange things to the mind. The endless horizon, the sameness of the days, the lack of landmarks. It was easy to lose track of time, to feel unmoored. Songs, chants, and stories helped. The crew would sing to pass the time, tell tales of gods and ancestors, recite genealogies. It wasn't just entertainment. It was a way of keeping identity alive, of reminding themselves who they were and why they were out there. And always, the breadfruit was part of those stories. A reminder of the home they had left and the home they hoped to build. The arrival, finally, after weeks of nothing but sea and sky, signs of land would appear. A drifting branch, a flock of seabirds, a change in the color of the water. The navigator would smile, the crew would cheer, and the canoe would press on. And then, at last, the outline of an island on the horizon. Landing wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The breadfruit saplings were planted, the animals released, the new home established. The voyage had succeeded. Legendary voyages and the memory of breadfruit, the ocean as a highway by now. You've probably realized that the Pacific wasn't an obstacle for Polynesians. It was a highway. A very wet, very dangerous highway, but still a highway. And breadfruit was one of the toll tickets. If you wanted to settle a new island, you brought it along. Every voyage was a gamble, but every successful voyage expanded the Polynesian world, linking islands into a vast network of kinship, trade, and shared culture. And in the stories that survived, breadfruit is always there in the background, quietly riding along. Asterisk, the story of Hawaiialolet. Start with one of the great remembered navigators. According to Hawaiian tradition, he was a master navigator who sailed from a homeland far to the east, bringing his family and plants with him. Among those plants, breadfruit, of course. The story goes that he named the islands after his children: Maui, Ua, Kauai, all family names, which is a very dad move, honestly. I discovered this island, so I'm naming it after my kid. You're welcome. Whether Hawaiialoa was a real person or a symbolic ancestor, the story reflects a truth. Voyages weren't just about exploration. They were about carrying life, people, animals, plants across the sea, and breadfruit was part of that life. The voyage of Hatu-Matuathon. There's Hatu-Matua, the legendary first settler of Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. According to tradition, he sailed from a distant homeland called Hiva, bringing with him his family, followers, and the essential canoe plants. Now, Easter Island isn't exactly prime breadfruit territory. The soil is poor, the climate marginal. Breadfruit struggled there, but the fact that Hatu-Matua brought it anyway shows how central it was. Even if it failed, you had to try, because what's a new home without breadfruit? The Marquesas Voyages, the Marquesas Islands, settled around 200 CE, were another key stop. From here, voyages radiated outward to Hawaii in the north, to Easter Island in the east, to Tahiti in the south. The Marquesas became a hub, a crossroads of Polynesian expansion, and breadfruit thrived there, becoming a staple of daily life. Groves covered the valleys, storage pits dotted the landscape, and breadfruit festivals marked the seasons. It's no coincidence that from this breadfruit-rich hub, voyagers launched some of the most ambitious journeys in human history. The long road to Aotearoa. Then there's New Zealand, reached around 1200 CE. It was the last major landmass settled by Polynesians. But here, breadfruit met its match. The climate was too cold. The trees couldn't survive. Imagine the disappointment. You've carried these saplings across thousands of miles, tended them like children, planted them with care, and then they just die. No breadfruit grows, no storage pits, no feasts. Instead, the Mbori had to adapt. They relied more on root crops like kamara, sweet potato, and on hunting and fishing. Breadfruit became a memory, a story of the homeland, a symbol of what had been lost. The breadfruit web taken together. These voyages created a web of breadfruit across the Pacific. From Samoa to Tahiti, from Hawaii to the Marquesas, from Rapa Nui to Micronesia, the tree spread with the people. Each island developed its own varieties, its own traditions, its own ways of cooking and storing. But the common thread remained. Breadfruit was the traveler, the migrant, the quiet companion of every voyage. The memory of navigators, then the navigators themselves, became legends. Their names remembered in chants, their voyages recited in genealogies. They weren't just sailors. They were culture bearers, memory keepers, the ones who carried the world in their heads. Breadfruit was part of their legacy. Not glamorous, not heroic, but essential. Because without breadfruit, the voyages would have been pointless. You can't build a society on fish alone. You need starch. You need trees. You need breadfruit. A gentle drift toward myth over time. The stories of these voyages blurred into myth. Navigators became demigods. Canoes became symbols of creation. Breadfruit became sacred, tied to gods and ancestors. And yet, beneath the myth, the practical truth remained. These were real voyages, real people, real plants. The myths preserved the memory, but the groves preserved the reality. The voyages of Tangier and Caricane, the traditions of the Cook Islands. Two great voyages stand out, Tangier and Carica. Their canoes, the vaka, carried not just people, but the full suite of canoe plants. Breadfruit, taro, bananas, coconuts, the whole traveling pantry. The stories say they quarreled, as voyagers often do, and ended up dividing the islands between them, which is a very human solution. Fine, you take that island, I'll take this one, and we'll both pretend we're not still annoyed. But the important part is that breadfruit was there. Even in the middle of political squabbles, the plants had to survive. Because you can't hold grudges on an empty stomach. Asterisk, the canoes of Tahiti was another great hub of voyaging. From here, canoes sailed to Hawaii, to the Marquesas. To Rapa Nui, Tahitian navigators carried with them not just breadfruit, but the rituals and chants that kept its memory alive. In Tahitian myth, the god Rongo was associated with bread. Planting a tree was an offering to him, a way of ensuring abundance. So every voyage that carried breadfruit was also, in a sense, a religious act. You weren't just moving plants. You were carrying the favor of the gods. The Hawaiian traditions remember multiple waves of settlement, each bringing new plants and practices. Breadfruit was among them, though in Hawaii it never became quite as dominant as taro. Still, it was valued, planted in groves, and woven into myth. One story tells of a famine when the god Ku sacrificed himself by sinking into the earth. From his body grew the first breadfruit tree, feeding his family and saving the people, which is both touching and slightly unsettling. The kind of bedtime story that makes you grateful for dinner, but also a little wary of trees. The Samoan Web Samoa, too, was a center of breadfruit culture. The Samoan word for breadfruit, ulu, appears across Polynesia, a linguistic thread tying the islands together. In Samoan tradition, breadfruit was linked to hospitality. Offering breadfruit to a guest was a sign of respect. Refusing breadfruit was an insult, which makes sense. If someone offers you free carbs, you take them. The memory of defeat. Not every voyage was a success. Some traditions remember canoes that never returned, navigators who vanished into the blue. And sometimes, the failure was remembered in the absence of breadfruit, on islands where breadfruit didn't grow. Like New Zealand, the memory of it lingered. The Maori remembered uru as a plant of the homeland, a symbol of warmth and abundance. Its absence was a reminder of distance, of loss, of the cold new world they had entered. Breadfruit as a cultural marker crossed the Pacific. Breadfruit became a marker of identity. To have breadfruit was to be part of the Polynesian world. To lack it was to be on the margins. It wasn't just food. It was a sign of belonging. A tree that tied you to ancestors, to voyages, to gods. A tree that said, we came from somewhere. We carry our world with us. The quiet hero of the Voyages and so. In the great stories of Polynesian navigation, breadfruit is rarely the star. The heroes are the navigators, the chiefs, the gods. But breadfruit is always there, quietly riding along, waiting to be planted. It's the quiet hero of the Voyages. The one that doesn't get the songs or the chants, but without which the songs would have ended long ago. Breadfruit and the ecology of islands. The island problem here's the thing about islands. They're fragile. Limited land, limited soil, limited water. You can't just plant whatever you want and expect it to thrive. Every crop had to earn its place. Breadfruit earned it. It was high yield, low maintenance, and long-lived. Once established, a grove could feed generations. But it also reshaped the landscape. Valleys that might have been forest became breadfruit orchards. Hillsides were terraced, cleared, and planted. It was agriculture, but it was also engineering. Polynesians weren't just planting trees. They were redesigning islands, groves as ecosystems. Breadfruit grove wasn't just trees. It was an ecosystem. Beneath the canopy, people planted taro, yam, and other crops. Chickens scratched in the undergrowth. Pigs rooted around the edges. The shade kept the soil moist. The leaves fell and decomposed, enriching the ground. The groves became self-sustaining, a kind of agroforest. It wasn't monoculture. It was polyculture, layered and diverse. A system that mimicked nature, but with breadfruit as the anchor dot. The balance of abundance. When breadfruit thrived, life was good. Feasts, festivals, security. Chiefs could boast of their groves. Families could store fermented paste. Children could grow up without hunger. But abundance had its own risks. Too much reliance on breadfruit meant vulnerability. A storm, a drought, a blight, and suddenly the abundance vanished. That's why Polynesians always carried multiple crops. Breadfruit was central, but taro, yam, coconut, and banana were backups. It was a diversified portfolio, ancient agriculture style. Breadfruit and soil. Breadfruit also shaped the soil. Its roots stabilized slopes, preventing erosion. Its leaf litter enriched the ground. In some places, breadfruit groves actually improved fertility over time. But in other places, overuse led to depletion. Too many trees, too much clearing, and the soil wore out. It was a delicate balance. Plant too little, and you starved. Plant too much, and you ruined the land. Breadfruit and water was another issue. Breadfruit needed moisture. In dry islands, groves had to be carefully placed near springs or streams. Irrigation systems were built, channels dug, water diverted in wetter islands. The problem was the opposite: too much water, leading to rot. So groves had to be managed, drained, balanced. It was constant work, constant adjustment. Breadfruit wasn't just a tree you planted and forgot. It was a relationship, a negotiation with the land. Breadfruit and animals, the groves also shaped animal life. Birds nested in the branches. Insects fed on the leaves and fruit. Pigs and chickens foraged beneath. Humans, of course, were the top of this little pyramid. They ate the breadfruit, the pigs, the chickens, the fish caught with nets woven from breadfruit fibers. Yes, even the tree itself was useful. Its wood was light and strong, perfect for canoes and houses. So breadfruit wasn't just food. It was architecture, technology, ecology, a tree that touched every part of life. Breadfruit and scarcity. But when things went wrong, they went very wrong. A cyclone could flatten groves in a single night. A drought could wither them. A pest could spread. That's when the underground storage pits mattered. Fermented breadfruit paste was the safety net. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept people alive, and it reinforced the role of chiefs. The ones who controlled the pits, who managed the groves, who could provide in times of scarcity. They held power. Breadfruit wasn't just ecology. It was politics, again. Breadfruit as a timekeeper. The cycles of breadfruit also structured time. The fruiting season marked abundance. The lean season marked scarcity. Festivals, rituals, and work schedules all followed the rhythm of the trees. It was a calendar written in green, a reminder that ecology and culture were inseparable, a gentle drift toward fragility. So, breadfruit was abundance, but also fragility. It was stability, but also risk. It was the tree that made life possible, but also the tree that reminded people how precarious life on an island could be. And in that balance, between feast and famine, abundance and scarcity, Polynesian societies found their rhythm perfect. Let's keep part 5 flowing. We've already looked to breadfruit as ecology, as abundance and fragility. Now we'll expand further into how it shaped daily island life, how people adapted when things went wrong, and how the tree itself became part of the environmental story of the Pacific. Same calm, dry, slightly snarky, sleepless historian tone, drifting along like a canoe on a long swell. The tree, as architecture breadfruit, wasn't just food. Its wood was light, strong, and easy to work. Perfect for canoes, houses, drums, and tools. A single tree could feed you, shade you, and then, when it was old, provide the lumber for your next canoe. It's the kind of multitasking we wish modern furniture could do. Imagine if your IKEA bookshelf also gave you dinner and a roof. Breadfruit was basically the Swiss Army knife of trees. The tree as shade on hot islands. Breadfruit groves also provided shade. Villages were often built near groves, not just for food, but for comfort. The broad leaves cooled the ground, making it bearable to work and live. Children played under the trees. Elders sat in the shade, telling stories. The grove wasn't just an orchard. It was a living community space. The tree as memory, because breadfruit trees live for decades, sometimes centuries. They became markers of memory. A tree planted by a grandparent could still be feeding the family generations later. Some groves were tied to genealogies. Families could trace their lineage through the trees they planted. Chiefs could point to groves as proof of their ancestors' power. The trees became living history books, written in bark and leaves. When breadfruit failed, but let's not romanticize too much. Breadfruit could fail. Cyclones could flatten groves. Droughts could kill them. disease could spread. When that happened, people turned to backups: taro, yam, coconut. But the loss of breadfruit was always a blow. It wasn't just losing food, it was losing security, memory, and identity. Some traditions even have stories of famine linked to breadfruit failure. Tales of desperate times when people survived only on scraps, waiting for the trees to recover. Breadfruit and climate breadfruit also tied people to climate cycles. El Niño events, with their droughts and storms, could devastate groves. Communities had to adapt, shifting, planting, relying on storage pits, tightening belts. It was a reminder that life on an island was always precarious. You could never take abundance for granted. The trees gave, but they could also withhold. Breadfruit as a social safety net. In some islands, breadfruit groves were communal. Families shared access. Chiefs redistributed harvests. Storage pits were opened in times of need. It was an early form of social security. Instead of a pension, you had a tree. Instead of a bank account, you had a pit of fermented paste. Not glamorous, but effective. And it reinforced community bonds. Sharing breadfruit wasn't just charity. It was obligation, reciprocity, the glue that held society together. Breadfruit and sustainability. Looking back, breadfruit groves were remarkably sustainable. They provided food, wood, shade, and soil fertility, all with minimal input. They were low carbon, zero waste, and organic before those words existed. It's ironic that modern agriculture, with all its technology, still struggles with sustainability. While Polynesians figured out a working system centuries ago with nothing but trees, chants, and canoes, a gentle drift towards symbolism. Breadfruit wasn't just ecology. It was architecture, memory, climate, community, and sustainability. It was the tree that made island life possible, but also the tree that reminded people of their limits. And in that balance, between abundance and fragility, between feast and famine, breadfruit became more than food. It became a symbol. Breadfruit in myth, metaphor, and memory setting the scene so far. We've treated breadfruit as food, as cargo, as ecology. But in Polynesia, nothing that important stays just practical. It becomes symbolic. It becomes myth. It becomes the kind of thing you tell stories about when the night is long and the stars are bright. Breadfruit wasn't just a tree. It was a metaphor for life, for love, for sacrifice. It was a character in myths, a gift from gods, a marker of identity. And tonight, we're going to drift through those stories. Slowly, gently, like a canoe gliding through calm water. The Hawaiian story of Kukle start in Hawaii, with the god Ku. Normally, Ku was the god of war. Not exactly the kind of guy you'd expect to be handing out snacks. But in one story, he lived as a man, married, had children, and then faced a famine. His family was starving. So Ku did the ultimate dad move. He sacrificed himself. He sank into the ground, and from his body grew the first breadfruit tree. Its fruit fed his family, and from then on, breadfruit was seen as a gift of life. It's a story that's both touching and unsettling. Imagine telling your kids, "Don't worry, I'll turn into a tree so you can eat." It's the kind of bedtime story that makes you grateful for dinner, but also a little suspicious of your garden. But the symbolism is clear. Breadfruit is life from sacrifice. It's abundance born from suffering. It's the reminder that survival often comes at a cost. The Tahitian gift of Rongoin Tahiti. Breadfruit was linked to the god Rongo, a deity of agriculture and fertility. Planting a breadfruit tree was an offering to him, a way of ensuring abundance. Rongo wasn't just about food. He was about continuity, about the cycles of life. Breadfruit, with its seasonal rhythms and its long-lived groves, was the perfect symbol. Planting a tree wasn't just farming. It was participating in the cosmic order. And so, every breadfruit grove was also a shrine. Every harvest was also a ritual. The tree wasn't just practical. It was sacred, the Samoan breadfruit of hospitality in Samoa. Breadfruit was tied to hospitality. Offering breadfruit to a guest was a sign of respect. Refusing breadfruit was an insult. It makes sense. Breadfruit was abundant, filling, and central to the diet. To share it was to share life. To withhold it was to withhold community. So breadfruit became a symbol of generosity, of welcome, of belonging. A Samoan proverb says, "The breadfruit tree does not eat its own fruit," meaning abundance is meant to be shared. Breadfruit as a metaphor for family across Polynesia. Breadfruit often symbolized family. The tree was the parent, the fruit the children. Planting a tree was like starting a household. In some traditions, breadfruit trees were planted at births, marking the arrival of a new life. The tree grew as the child grew, a living parallel. When the child married, the tree's fruit fed the feast. When the child died, the tree shaded the grave. It was a cradle-to-grave companion, a reminder that life, like breadfruit, is cyclical. Breadfruit and love there are also love stories. In some myths, a man proves his devotion by planting a breadfruit tree for his beloved. In others, a woman mourns her lover by tending his grove. Breadfruit became a symbol of commitment. Not flashy, not dramatic, but steady. A tree that takes years to mature, that feeds for generations, that requires care and patience. It's not roses or chocolates. It's not fireworks or serenades. It's breadfruit, which honestly is a much more practical symbol of love. Breadfruit and death breadfruit also appeared in stories of death. In some traditions, the spirits of the dead were said to rest in breadfruit groves. The trees became places of memory, of mourning, of continuity. Planting a breadfruit tree for the dead was a way of keeping them alive, of ensuring their presence lingered in the fruit that fed the living. It's a quiet, gentle symbolism, not dramatic, not frightening, just the steady reminder that life and death are part of the same cycle, and that breadfruit, in its own way, bridges the two. Breadfruit in Proverbs Polynesian languages are full of proverbs about breadfruit. In Hawaii, "Hey, ulu o kajina, the land is like breadfruit," meaning the land provides. In Samoa, "Uafua la ulu, the breadfruit has borne fruit," meaning success has come. In Tahiti, "I ute whenua, the land is breadfruit," meaning abundance is here. Each proverb ties breadfruit to prosperity, to success, to life itself. It's the tree that stands for everything good. Breadfruit as a symbol of continuity above all. Breadfruit symbolized continuity. A tree planted today would feed children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren. It was a gift to the future. That's why planting a breadfruit tree was often a ceremonial act. It wasn't just about food. It was about legacy, about saying, "I was here, and I thought of you." A gentle drift toward breadfruit in rituals. Breadfruit wasn't just food. It was myth, metaphor, memory. It was love, death, family, continuity, and in rituals, births, marriages, funerals, feasts, it was always there. The tree that fed the body, the story that fed the soul. Ritual at the grove breadfruit wasn't just eaten, it was written. Planting a tree could be accompanied by chants, offerings, even small sacrifices. The act of digging a hole and placing a sapling wasn't just agriculture, it was cosmology. You were inserting life into the earth, asking the gods to bless it, and promising to care for it. In some islands, breadfruit planting marked major life events. A birth might be celebrated with a tree, a marriage might be sealed with one, even a death could be honored by planting breadfruit, ensuring the deceased's memory lived on in the fruit that fed the living dot. It's a quiet, steady symbolism, not flashy, not dramatic, just the slow, patient reminder that life continues, one tree at a time. Breadfruit in feasts were political theater, but they were also ritual. Breadfruit was roasted in earth ovens, mashed into pastes, mixed with coconut milk. The preparation itself could be ceremonial, with specific roles for men and women. Chiefs and commoners. The first fruits of the season were often offered to the gods or to chiefs, a way of acknowledging that abundance came from beyond human effort. Only after the ritual offering could the community eat. So breadfruit wasn't just food. It was a bridge between the human and the divine, the everyday and the sacred breadfruit. In art, breadfruit also appeared in art. Its broad, lobed leaves were carved into wood, painted on tapa cloth, woven into mats. The tree itself, with its spreading branches and heavy fruit, became a motif of abundance. In some places, breadfruit wood was used for drums. The sound of the drum carried the rhythm of the tree into dance and ceremony. The tree didn't just feed the body, it fed the senses, the spirit, the community. Breadfruit in storytelling. Storytellers used breadfruit as metaphor. A lazy person might be compared to a tree that never bore fruit. A generous person might be praised as a tree heavy with abundance. Children grew up hearing these comparisons, learning that breadfruit wasn't just something you ate. It was a moral compass, a way of understanding character and behavior. Breadfruit and colonial encounters, then came the Europeans, and with them, a very different view of breadfruit. To Polynesians, breadfruit was sacred, symbolic, central. To Europeans, it was cheap calories, a way to feed enslaved laborers in the Caribbean. Q. The infamous voyage of the HMS Bounty. Captain Bligh was tasked with transporting breadfruit from Tahiti to the West Indies. The idea was simple: feed enslaved workers with breadfruit, because apparently dignity and decent wages weren't on the menu. We all know how that went. Mutiny, drama, Hollywood movies. But what often gets lost is the irony. Europeans turned breadfruit from a sacred symbol into a tool of exploitation. It's a reminder that meaning isn't fixed. The same fruit that symbolized love and continuity in Polynesia became a symbol of control and oppression in the Caribbean. Breadfruit. In the Caribbean and yet breadfruit adapted. In Jamaica, Trinidad, and other islands, it became part of local cuisine. Roasted, fried, boiled, it found a new life. But the symbolism was different. In the Caribbean, breadfruit carried the memory of slavery, of colonialism, of forced labor. It wasn't the tree of love or continuity. It was the tree of survival under oppression. Even today, Caribbean communities have a complicated relationship with breadfruit, loved as food, but remembered as a tool of exploitation. Breadfruit in modern revival in recent decades. Breadfruit has seen a revival. Scientists praise it as a superfood, high yield, nutritious, climate resilient, Development projects promote it as a solution to food insecurity. But for Pacific communities, the revival isn't just about nutrition. It's about culture. Planting breadfruit is a way of reconnecting with ancestors, with traditions, with identity in Hawaii. Breadfruit is being replanted in traditional groves called ulu groves. In Samoa, breadfruit festivals celebrate the tree's role in culture. Across the Pacific, breadfruit is being reclaimed as more than food. As heritage, breadfruit, as climate symbol breadfruit, has also become a symbol in the climate crisis. As rising seas threaten islands, as storms grow stronger, breadfruit stands as both hope and fragility. It's resilient, yes, but it's also vulnerable. A reminder that island life has always been precarious, always balanced between abundance and disaster. Planting breadfruit today is both practical and symbolic. It's food security, but it's also a statement. We are still here, still planting, still thinking of the future. Breadfruit in Diaspora 4, Polynesian communities abroad. Breadfruit is memory. Eating it, cooking it, planting it in foreign soil. It's a way of staying connected in cities far from the Pacific. Breadfruit becomes a taste of home, a reminder of groves and chants and stories. It's nostalgia you can roast and eat. Breadfruit as global icon, and so breadfruit has traveled again. From Southeast Asia to Polynesia, from Polynesia to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean to the world. It's now studied by botanists, promoted by NGOs, featured in cookbooks. But beneath the global hype, the old meanings remain. The myths, the proverbs, the rituals. The tree that fed ancestors still feeds descendants. A gentle drift toward legacies. So what is breadfruit? It's food, yes, but it's also myth, memory, metaphor, ritual, art, politics, ecology, and identity. It's the tree that turned islands into homes, the tree that carried love and sacrifice, the tree that survived colonialism and found new life, the tree that still stands, green and heavy with fruit, in groves across the Pacific. The botany and science of breadfruit, the tree itself. So, what exactly is breadfruit? Botanically, it's Artocarpus altilis, a member of the mulberry family, which is already a little funny because it looks nothing like a mulberry. It's a large, evergreen tree, often 15 to 20 meters tall, with broad, deeply lobed leaves that look like they were designed by someone who got carried away with a stencil. The fruit itself is round or oval, green and bumpy, sometimes as big as a football. Inside, the flesh is starchy, pale, and blandly versatile. When roasted, it develops that bread-like texture that gave it its name. When boiled, it tastes like a potato that's been through a tropical vacation. And unlike many crops, breadfruit doesn't need much pampering. Once established, a tree can produce for decades, yielding hundreds of fruits a year. It's the kind of plant that makes you wonder why the rest of agriculture is so complicated. Seedless and seedy, here's the catch. Most Polynesian breadfruit varieties are seedless, which is great for eating, but terrible for propagation. You can't just plant seeds. You have to take root cuttings or suckers, wrap them carefully, and coax them into new trees. That's why breadfruit had to travel as living cargo. You couldn't just toss a bag of seeds into the canoe. You had to carry the tree itself, roots and all, which is both inconvenient and impressive. There are seeded varieties, mostly in Southeast Asia, where breadfruit originated. But Polynesians preferred the seedless ones. Easier to eat, less fuss, more starch, which meant more work for the Voyages, but better meals in the long run. Varieties across the Pacific over centuries, Polynesians developed dozens of varieties. Some were prized for roasting, others for boiling, others for fermenting. Some had smoother skin, some rougher, some ripened early, some late. In Hawaii alone, there were more than 20 named varieties, each with its own flavor, texture, and cultural associations. Chiefs might favor one variety, commoners another. Certain varieties were linked to rituals, others to everyday meals. It was a living library of breadfruit diversity, carefully cultivated and passed down. Breadfruit as a superfood, fast forward to today, and scientists have rediscovered breadfruit. Turns out it's not just starchy filler. It's rich in fiber, vitamins, and minerals. Gluten-free, low glycemic, and surprisingly nutritious. Cue the headlines: breadfruit, the superfood of the future, which is a little ironic, given that Polynesians already knew it was the superfood of the past. Researchers now promote breadfruit as a solution to food insecurity. It grows well in tropical climates, requires little input, and produces abundantly. In a world facing climate change and population growth, breadfruit looks like a quiet hero waiting in the wings. Breadfruit and climate. Resilience. Breadfruit is also climate resilient. It tolerates drought, poor soils, and high temperatures. It's less fussy than many staple crops, and once established, it requires minimal care. That makes it attractive for regions struggling with climate change. Plant a grove, and you've got food security for decades. No annual planting, no heavy irrigation, no chemical fertilizers. Just trees doing their thing. It's the kind of low-tech solution that feels almost too simple, which probably explains why it's overlooked in favor of more complicated fixes. Breadfruit in science. Scientists study breadfruit for its genetics, its nutritional profile, its potential for breeding. They've mapped its genome, traced its origins, catalogued its varieties. They've found that breadfruit originated in New Guinea and the Indo-Malayan region, then spread eastward into Polynesia. Along the way, it was domesticated, selected, and diversified. It's a story written not just in myths and chants, but in DNA. The tree carries the memory of human migration in its genes. Breadfruit and global agriculture. There's growing interest in spreading breadfruit beyond the Pacific and Caribbean. Projects in Africa, Central America, and South Asia promote it as a sustainable crop. The idea is simple: plant breadfruit, feed communities, reduce reliance on imported grains. It's not a silver bullet, but it's a sturdy arrow in the quiver of food security. And it's poetic, in a way. The same tree that once traveled by canoe across the Pacific is now traveling by airplane and shipping container across the globe. Still migrating, still adapting, still feeding. Breadfruit and technology. Modern technology has also joined the story. Tissue culture techniques allow breadfruit to be propagated in labs, shipped as tiny plantlets, and grown anywhere with the right climate. It's a far cry from wrapping roots in coconut husks and hoping for the best. But the principle is the same. Carry the tree, plant it, feed the people. A gentle drift toward continuities. So breadfruit isn't just a relic of the past. It's a living bridge between ancient voyagers and modern scientists, between myth and genome, between canoe and laboratory. It's the same tree, carrying the same promise: abundance, continuity, survival. The revival of breadfruit, heritage, festivals, and identity, the return of the groves. For centuries, breadfruit groves were the backbone of Pacific life. Then came colonialism, cash crops, and imported foods. Rice, flour, sugar, and canned goods pushed breadfruit to the margins. In some places, it was dismissed as poor people's food. But in recent decades, something has shifted. Communities have begun replanting groves, restoring old varieties, and reviving rituals. Breadfruit is no longer just a tree in the background. It's a statement, a way of saying, we are still here, and so are our traditions. Breadfruit festivals across the Pacific. Breadfruit festivals have sprung up. In Hawaii, Samoa, Tahiti, and beyond, communities gather to celebrate the tree. There are cooking competitions, storytelling sessions, planting ceremonies. It's not just about food. It's about pride, about reclaiming a heritage that was nearly lost, about teaching children that breadfruit isn't just something their grandparents ate. It's something worth celebrating. And yes, there are breadfruit pancakes, breadfruit chips, breadfruit curries. Because nothing says cultural revival like turning your ancestral staple into trendy snacks. Breadfruit and education schools have also joined the revival. Children learn to plant breadfruit, to tend groves, to cook the fruit. Elders teach the old chants, the old proverbs, the old stories. It's intergenerational education rooted in the land. A way of passing on not just knowledge, but identity. Planting a breadfruit tree becomes a lesson in history, ecology, and culture all at once. Breadfruit and health, there's also a health angle. Imported foods brought not just convenience, but problems. Obesity, diabetes, heart disease. Breadfruit, with its fiber and nutrients, is part of the solution. Communities are rediscovering that the old foods were healthier than the new ones. That breadfruit, taro, yam, and fish are better for the body than white bread and soda. So breadfruit revival isn't just cultural, it's medical, a way of healing communities, one roasted fruit at a time. Breadfruit and identity for many Pacific Islanders. Breadfruit has become a symbol of identity. Planting a tree is a way of saying, I belong here. I am part of this land, this culture, this lineage. In diaspora communities, breadfruit is a taste of home. Eating it, cooking it, planting it in foreign soil, it's a way of staying connected. A reminder of groves and chants and ancestors. It's nostalgia you can roast, memory you can mash, heritage you can fry into chips. Breadfruit and art artists have also embraced breadfruit. Its leaves appear in paintings, carvings, tattoos. Its image is used in logos, posters, cultural campaigns. The tree has become a visual shorthand for Pacific identity, a way of saying, this is who we are, this is what we carry. Breadfruit and activism in some places. Breadfruit has even become political. Planting groves is a form of resistance, a way of reclaiming land and culture from colonial legacies. It's quiet activism. No protests, no slogans, just trees growing steadily, feeding people, reminding everyone that the old ways still matter. Breadfruit and the future looking ahead. Breadfruit is poised to play an even bigger role. Scientists promote it as a climate-resilient crop. Communities celebrate it as heritage. Chefs experiment with it as cuisine. It's both ancient and modern, practical and symbolic. The same tree that fed ancestors is now feeding identity, pride, and resilience. A gentle drift toward continuities. So breadfruit revival isn't just about food. It's about memory, health, identity, and future. It's about planting trees, not just for calories, but for culture. It's the quiet return of a hero that never really left. Breadfruit goes global, the Caribbean chapter, and beyond, leaving the Pacific for thousands of years. Breadfruit was a Pacific story. Canoes, groves, myths, rituals. Then Europeans arrived, and suddenly breadfruit was drafted into a very different narrative. To Polynesians, it was sacred. To Europeans, it was cheap calories, a way to feed enslaved laborers in the Caribbean. Because apparently, when you're running a brutal plantation economy, the first thing you think is, what if we shipped some tropical starch across the world? And so, breadfruit left the Pacific, not in canoes, but in the holds of European ships. The HMS Bounty enter, the HMS Bounty. Captain William Bligh was tasked with transporting breadfruit saplings from Tahiti to the West Indies. The plan: feed enslaved workers in Jamaica and other colonies with breadfruit. Reducing costs for plantation owners, Bligh collected hundreds of saplings, carefully tended by his crew. But the voyage didn't go smoothly. The crew mutinied, famously setting Bligh adrift in a small boat. The breadfruit saplings tossed overboard, because apparently, when you're rebelling against authority, the first thing you do is kill the plants. It's ironic. Polynesians had carried breadfruit across thousands of miles of ocean with care and devotion. Europeans tried once and ended up with a mutiny. Bligh's second attempt, however, was persistent. He made a second voyage, this time successfully transporting breadfruit to the Caribbean. The trees were planted, the groves established. But here's the twist. The enslaved workers didn't like breadfruit. They saw it as foreign, imposed, a symbol of control. Many refused to eat it. Plantation owners had to force it into diets, turning a sacred Pacific staple into a bitter reminder of oppression. So breadfruit's Caribbean story began not with love, but with resentment. Breadfruit in the Caribbean over time, though breadfruit adapted. Communities found ways to cook it, to make it their own. Roasted, fried, boiled, curried. In Jamaica, it became a beloved side dish. In Trinidad, it found its way into stews, but the memory of its arrival lingered. For many, breadfruit carried the weight of slavery, of colonialism, of forced labor. It was survival food, not celebration food, even today. Caribbean communities have a complicated relationship with breadfruit, loved as cuisine, but remembered as a tool of exploitation. Breadfruit as migrant from the Caribbean. Breadfruit spread further, to Central America, to Africa, to South Asia. Everywhere it went, it adapted. Different climates, different cuisines, different meanings. In some places, it became a staple. In others, a curiosity. But always, it carried its layered history, Pacific sacredness. European exploitation, Caribbean survival. Breadfruit in global cuisine today. Breadfruit appears in cookbooks and restaurants around the world. Chefs experiment with it. Breadfruit chips, breadfruit flour, breadfruit desserts. It's ironic again. The same fruit once dismissed as slave food is now marketed as a gourmet ingredient. History has a way of turning symbols upside down. Breadfruit as global heritage for Pacific Islanders. Seeing breadfruit abroad is bittersweet. On one hand, it's pride. Their ancestors carried this tree across oceans, and now it feeds the world. On the other, it's loss. The tree was taken, stripped of its sacredness. turned into a commodity, and yet the tree endures. It grows in the Pacific, in the Caribbean, in Africa. In Asia, it carries all its histories at once, sacred, exploited, beloved, resented, a gentle drift toward legacies. Breadfruit's global journey is complicated. It's a story of migration, of colonialism, of adaptation. A story of how one tree can mean life in one place, oppression in another, nostalgia in a third dot. It's the quiet reminder that food is never just food. It's history, politics, memory, identity. Breadfruit as metaphor, the tree and Uster, tree that traveled. Breadfruit is, at its core, a migrant. Born in Southeast Asia, carried eastward by Voyages, planted in Polynesia, shipped by Europeans, rooted in the Caribbean, spread to Africa and beyond. It's a tree that never stayed still. A tree that crossed oceans, endured storms, survived mutinies, adapted to new soils. A tree that carries in its roots the story of human movement. And in that sense, breadfruit is us. Always moving, always adapting, always carrying memory and identity across distances. The tree that feeds breadfruit is also a reminder of the basics. For all our technology, our politics, our drama, survival still comes down to food, to calories, to starch, to something that fills the belly. Polynesians knew this. That's why they carried breadfruit, not because it was glamorous, but because it was steady, because it fed people year after year, generation after generation. It's a quiet lesson. The foundations of life are simple. A tree, a grove, a meal dot. The tree that connects breadfruit connects. It connects islands across the Pacific through shared myths, proverbs, and groves. It connects the Pacific and the Caribbean through colonial history and cuisine. It connects past and present, ancestors and descendants, myth and science. It's a reminder that the world is woven together, not by grand events, but by quiet continuities, by trees, by food, by memory. The tree that endures breadfruit has endured cyclones, droughts, colonialism, neglect. It has been sacred, exploited, forgotten, revived. And still it grows, heavy with fruit, shading villages, feeding families. Its resilience in leafy form. A reminder that survival isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's just steady, patient endurance. The tree as a metaphor for Usso. What does breadfruit tell us about ourselves? That migration is survival. That memory is carried in roots as well as in stories. That abundance is fragile, but also renewable. That identity can be planted, lost, and replanted again. Breadfruit is a mirror. In its journeys, we see our own. In its resilience, we see our own. In its quiet endurance, we see the possibility of our own. A gentle drift toward closure so. As we close this long, sleepy voyage, picture it, a breadfruit tree, tall and green, its leaves rustling in the evening breeze. Beneath it, children playing, elders chanting, lovers whispering, scientists measuring. The same tree, carrying all its histories at once. The canoe has landed. The groves are planted. The stories are told. The fruit is ripe. Breadfruit, the migrant, the survivor, the sacred, the exploited, the revived. The tree of life, the tree of memory, the tree of continuity. And tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the story of breadfruit be a lullaby. A reminder that life, like the tree, is steady, cyclical, enduring. that we, too, are voyagers, carrying our roots across oceans, planting them in new soil, feeding the future. So close your eyes, let the waves rock you, and dream of canoes gliding under the stars, breadfruit saplings swaying in the hull, the promise of abundance waiting on the horizon.